Sure.
All right, we'll just confirm 1 second. Okay, excellent. Here we are after a little bit of technical difficulties, but we are back with Acharya of Dharma Nation. And I really enjoyed our first discussion. I think that would be very enlightening for anyone interested in how Eastern philosophy, in the form of Sanatana Dharma, also known as Vedanta, you may call it Eastern philosophy or something more general as well, connects to Platonism, which is my particular area of interest philosophically. And the number of parallels were extremely striking, and it really raises questions of what is this underlying philosophy shared among the Indo-European tradition. So I definitely recommend checking that out if that sounds interesting to you. But Acharya, for those who missed the first conversation we had, would you mind introducing yourself to our audience here?
Sure, certainly. Well, first, before I even do that, Eric, thank you so much for having me on again. The first time was absolutely wonderful. As I said back then, you are truly a wonderful interviewer, and it was a joy being on. So, thank you for having me on again. As far as myself, I'll make it very brief. My full name, for of course, a lot of Westerners, is a little bit difficult, but it's Sri Dharma Pavartaka Acharya, but just Acharya for short. And I'm someone who I'm living in America, thus the American accent. I have been personally a follower of what is properly called Sanatana Dharma for about 51 years, going on 52. So, for quite some time, actually, I've been following this path. And for myself, I always have to make this clear for people for whom it's not obvious. I'm not Indian, I'm not Asian in any way whatsoever. I'm 100% Mediterranean European, born in Brooklyn, New York, of all places. I'm half Italian and half Spanish, actually. But indeed, I fell in love with this path at a very, very young age. And I've been on this path for all this time. And now I've been a teacher of this path for 37 years, I believe, something like that. And indeed, that is, I have to say we, I can't say I, we have done quite a bit to educate the world about this path of Sanatana Dharma. And when I say we have a movement. Certainly, we have a YouTube channel as well. That's peripheral to what we do. But we have a movement called the International Sanatana Dharma Society. The main website for that is dharmacentral.com. But we've put out many books. I've written 13 books thus far, with many more coming. And indeed, the entire idea is to present this truly ancient path, what we consider, what many people, most scholars consider the most ancient spiritual path on earth, to primarily a Western audience. I have many Indian students as well, actually, but our goal is especially to present this to Westerners. And interestingly, and we've talked about this, I'm sure we'll talk about this more today, not as a quote unquote Eastern path, something foreign, something alien to the European mindset, the European person, but on the contrary, as far as we're concerned, we see the development of religion in Europe itself going back through several stages. Of course, now it's atheist. Now it's primarily secular. Before that, it was primarily Christian. Before that, it was primarily what people will call paganism. I like to use the term pre Christian European religions. And as far as I and actually quite a few people are concerned, previous to even that, so going back in Europe, let's say 4,000, 5,000 years ago, the religion was Vedic, what we would recognize as Vedic, not Indian, not curry, cobras, caste, and cows, not the stereotypes that people have, but Vedic in the greatest sense of this term. So, thus, as a European American practicing Sanatana Dharma, I don't see myself as practicing, again, alien religion, but rather a European religion that again was the religion of Europe before even what we call paganism. But I'll leave it at that. Um, that's my story.
All right, excellent. And I do want to touch a little bit more about that subject of the kind of ethnic or racial origins of this philosophy. For a long time, I identified as a perennialist. And to an extent, I still do. I think there's one underlying truth that many different traditions have touched upon. In Hinduism, Vedanta, Sanatana Dharma, we have the largest body of texts giving insight into this very ancient tradition. We also have Egyptian mystery school texts that resonate with some of these same conclusions. We have Platonic philosophy, and the Neoplatonists believed that Plato derived his philosophy from a much more ancient system. They actually called it the group that formulated this philosophy the ancients. Aristotle refers to them as well. Iamblichus makes a lot of that there was this one high philosophy in ancient times. So I wonder how deep it really goes. And it seems to be perhaps even beyond the Indo-European peoples specifically. That's a big part of our identity as, Westerners today, the Indo-European expansions that came out of the steppe about 5,000 years ago. But do you think there's some element of this belief system that goes even deeper than that? And who can we pin it to? Because, with the Egyptians, we do share some common ancestry going back, tens of thousands of years. There is, a connection even there. So if you could point to, in mundane historical time, where did this come from? Where is Sanatana Dharma born?
Mm, very good. Well, now just to clarify, you're asking from an ethnic perspective specifically. That's what you're asking from.
Well,
Like, who were the?
yeah, who came up with it? Who were the people?
Okay, good, good. Yes, in that case, yes, I would love to address that. First of all, when it comes to the tradition itself, several things that you said are indeed quite true, and many of the ancients did realize that actually, when I say the ancients, let's say the axial period, a little bit before that, we consider them ancient. They, of course, understood that no, what they would consider ancient, again, going back, let's say 4 or 5 thousand years from now, there was indeed one unified tradition. And, there were different names for it. However, the description is universal. That's what is nice. And that's how we can pinpoint exactly what this was. Again, names come and go. There are many different names for this in every ancient language, every modern language on earth. But the basic idea of what the universal concept was that the truly ancient peoples, the truly wise peoples followed was natural law. Indeed, this is what we call dharma. Dharma, the word dharma itself, yeah, it's not sectarian, it's not an Eastern term. It means literally natural law. That's the translation of dharma. So the idea indeed was that if you go back far enough, and that's what I was alluding to when I was talking about how even in Europe, if you go back far enough, you discover something. And we call it Vedic. If you want to be more general, you could say it is living in accordance with natural law itself being a manifestation upon earth of the grace of God. And this natural law is not something sectarian. It's like math is not sectarian. It's not, if you're a Scottish Presbyterian, 1 + 1 equals not 2, it equals something else. It has nothing to do with sectarianism. What it has to do with is indeed discovering those natural laws that are inherent in nature itself. And if you discover that, if that is taught to you, and more importantly, if you practice that, then you are living in accordance with God's will, or depending on, what tradition you're following, the will of the gods, plural, or God. But in any case, you're living as one should. And that means a life that is healthy, that is wholesome, that is good, that is, again, in accordance with nature. And that means in every way. Literally, that means from what we eat to how we think, to how we dress, to our philosophical system, and on and on and on. So this one could say is indeed the origin of everything, religiously and philosophically speaking. Now we have sects, now we have denominations, now we have the great world religions. Interestingly, in accordance with Sanatana Dharma, this is all new. And when I say new, I mean the last 2,500 years, roughly. If you go back to Zoroastrianism, maybe slightly before. But at one time, there was one path. And again, it was natural law. And as far as its origination, let me talk about that for a moment. The path itself has no origination. Indeed, this is why in the Sanskrit it is known as Sanatana Dharma. And what that means, it's a beautiful description. Sanatana means that which has necessary existence. It doesn't come into being, it doesn't go out of being, it always is, it's eternal. And then Dharma. Dharma, I explained, natural law. So, that being the case, you can't say that natural law was founded, quote unquote. Oh, it can be lost to people's perception, it can be regained. So it kind of ebbs and flows in that way as far as our understanding of it, but it is always there. So, that being the case, there is no, let's say, founding of Sanatana Dharma. However, you could say that there is um, that there are a people who are most closely associated with Sanatana Dharma. And how we know this specifically is in accordance with the scriptures of Sanatana Dharma, and actually a lot of texts that exist outside of the Vedic tradition as well. And those are the Arya Manushya. Those are the Aryan people. The Vedic scriptures themselves talk about this from beginning to end, from Rig Veda all the way through to the Puranas and every other layer of literature. We know that even the Buddha, Gautama Buddha, spoke about this, the Eightfold Noble Path. Well, the word that he used was Arya, same word. So, indeed, as far as who these people are who are most closely associated with the path of Sanatana Dharma, it is the Arya people. Arya itself, interestingly, has many connotations, of course, throughout much of the 19th and 20th century, and then with somewhat smaller groups even today, it has purely racial connotations. And truthfully, that's one of the connotations, but it's not the only connotation. Indeed, it's not even the primary one. The term Arya, quite literally, the connotation of it, the actual translation is noble. It means one who is noble. So, aretva, for example, that's another word that comes from the same verb root that means nobility. So, an individual who is noble is considered to be Arya, and to be Arya means to follow the natural law perfectly. So, indeed, if we were to say that there were a people who are closely associated with Sanatana Dharma, it is what in English we would call the Aryan people or the Arya. And who are those people ethnically? They are individuals who look like you and like me. Those were the original Arya.
Right. Of course, the Buddha is described as having blue eyes if you look into the historical depictions of him.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's for some people that's no surprise, but many people have this conception that, Hinduism is a religion of a very foreign people, very far away. But there's actually some good evidence that there was something like, Vedism in Russia prior to the invasions, the steppe invasions into India. The first horse burial that matches the descriptions we find in the Rig Veda is found at Sintashta in European Russia. And we do know a lot genetically about the people that lived at Sintashta. And yeah, they shared my Y-DNA haplotype, R1A. Probably a lot of them looked like me. Many looked like you. European peoples in general were heavily influenced by um, these people. And I think there must be deeper roots than that as well, because this is a group of people who are living on the open steppe. They've acquired knowledge of natural law over millennia, thousands and thousands of years of, shamans investigating the metaphysical realm as well as, physical medicinal properties of plants and how, the different elements of the ecosystem, including animal life, work together. And they really developed a science of it. Joseph Campbell, the great comparative mythologist, believed there were two primary kind of underlying mythological currents in mankind. The great hunt tradition of the northern steppes and Europe, which, when you think of cavemen, taking down big game with spears, they believed that the animal would give itself to the hunter, and there's a special spiritual connection there. And they had, I think, necessarily to develop some concept of what the soul is, what the self is out of that. In the South, it was a little bit different, and they had this planting based mythological scheme that involved a principal sacrifice. You know, the plant has to be buried so that it can be born again. I do think there's perennial wisdom in that path as well, but certainly I'm a partisan of the Great Northern Path. I think there's some special connection we have to the animal world, and so we've really paid attention to the nature of soul. So I guess with that out of the way, this kind of historical background to it, what are those kind of first questions that you would ask yourself that drew you into the subject matter of religion? You know, what is it? I'm right now I'm covering the first Alcibiades in my courses on Platonism, and the main question there is the nature of the self. You know, you want to do
Mhm.
all these things with your life, but like who are you to accomplish the things you want to accomplish? We have to have that self-knowledge, you know, at the oracle at Delphi, I believe, it was inscribed, "Know thyself," this maxim that the Greeks took very seriously. So, is that an appropriate starting point, you think, for religious life and insight, or is there another kind of appropriate starting point wanting to understand Sanatana Dharma?
Here's another instance that shows us that when we look at so many different truly ancient traditions, we see commonality between them. Interestingly, in Vedanta also, and maybe in a little while I can explain what Vedanta is, but in Vedanta also, you start in the same way. You have to start with knowing the knower. You know, as an individual is searching for the meaning of life, literally the meaning of life, with every adjacent question that goes along with that search, there are so many questions we can ask. What is the nature of that which is outside of self? What is the nature of God? You know, what are the natural laws, et cetera, morality, ethics? But truthfully, it begins with self inquiry. It begins with first knowing the knower. Indeed, this is how it's described in the Upanishads, which are very important Vedantic texts within Sanatana Dharma. First, you have to know the knower. That is, before you can claim, I have knowledge of X thing, who is that I? Who has the knowledge to begin with? So it's very much the same idea as the Platonism, as so many different traditions. First, we know ourselves. And of course, interestingly, some traditions, even within Sanatana Dharma, will kind of stop there. That is, the goal is only self inquiry and knowing who and what we are. But then, without going further and also asking, well, is there not just a self, but to state it as Ramanuja would say it, a self of myself? In other words, is there God? Is there something that is my origin? Which is, of course, the natural, logical next step to ask. I am here, I am me. All right. I may, through meditation, contemplation, come to know my inner self very well, understand the nature of my soul. But what is the origination of that? You know, it can't be something that is just self originating, because we understand there's a plurality of souls. There are so many souls in the world. Is everyone their own creator? And if that's the case, why don't we remember that? So, and on and on. So, all that being the case, the natural next step is then to ask, you know, to use the Western term, is there God? Is there that which is the source of all souls? But yes, it begins with self inquiry. And when it comes to that topic, within Sanatana Dharma and the Vedanta school specifically, which you could say is the height of philosophical attainment within Sanatana Dharma, it absolutely begins with that, but it doesn't end with that, you know, and for many reasons that we could go into. But yes, again, you see that parallel in the same way that the Platonists and so many other people, Aristotle, so many people begin with that first step of inquiry. Who am I? Then, once knowing the knower, now you can go on to know other things.
Well, on that point, then, what is the self, and what are the elements of the soul? In Platonism, Plato kind of breaks down different aspects of the soul in different ways. The thing that most people are familiar with is the tripartite soul, And I know that that exists in Sanatana Dharma as well. There's the rational soul, logisticon, and then the kind of courageous, spirited emotion part of the soul, thumos. And then under that, there is epithumia or appetite. But Plato also breaks it down in terms of the different cognitive functions belonging to the rational soul. Platonists would say that the rational soul is especially the self. The bodily aspects are part of the total soul body compound, of course, but like the soul itself is really more, you know, closely related to those logical cognitive functions. And those are broken down in the divided line into intellect, discursive reason, opinion, and sense data. So in a vein sort of like that, how can we break down, how can we divide the soul to understand what its faculties are, and then how can we recognize, when those faculties are operating well? How do we break down the soul to understand it, to know that we're thinking how we should be thinking?
Mhm. Sure, very good question. When it comes to the Vedantic understanding of the nature of self, that is a better translation of the term Atman, which is exactly what we're talking about, more so than soul. When we look at what is the essential nature of Atman, of self, it's a little bit differently understood than it is in Platonism. So many of the elements that you've described, for example, some of them are indeed considered to be essential attributes of the self. A few are considered to be more aspects of the self as the self is experiencing itself within the material world. So, first, we have to talk about what pure self is. What is the pure Atman as a transcendent unit of consciousness? So, before it even has any contact with any materiality whatsoever. We have to first understand that, and then we can go on to other things. The Atman itself, that is the self, the soul, what we would call soul in the Western world, itself is of the nature of pure consciousness, pure awareness, pure experience. In fact, many philosophers in Sanatana Dharma will actually say that the self, the soul, is the experiencer. So, this is a very nice, very simple way of understanding what is self versus not self. Anything that is experienced at any given time is not self. That which is the experiencer is the self. So, for example, myself sitting here, I have a microphone in front of me, obviously a computer, a cup, so many different objects. If I'm experiencing it, it is not me. Rather, who am I? Patanjali talks about this in the Yoga Sutras. He calls it drashtur. That's his word for the soul. Drashtur means experiencer. So the actual soul is of the nature of pure consciousness. And interestingly, the soul can't really be divided. However, you can see attributive features of the soul. You can see essential features, you can see secondary attributes, tertiary attributes. The most important elements of the soul are really almost non-different from the essence of the soul. And I'll talk about just a few of those. And they make sense, actually. First of all, and I'll skip all the Sanskrita. There's Sanskrita for each of these terms, but I'll skip those. The first of these is indeed self-awareness. That's the first thing. If we don't have self-awareness, we're a rock. We have to have awareness of self, of what we are. Not even necessarily who, but at least that we are. So that's the first element. The second element is awareness of awareness of that which is not us. So that means other souls. Now we're talking about this is all when we are in that transcendent state, before there's any materiality whatsoever. These things arise. So there's self-awareness, awareness of other. Then there is desire, and then there is will. I'm sorry, the other way around. There is free will, and then there is desire. With free will, as soon as the element of other comes into being, necessarily there has to be free will. And the reason why that's the case is so that we can assess other, so we can choose, do I want proximity to other or the opposite, to be away from that other. And then finally, indeed, comes that what you would call appetite, that desire. that yearning, that desire for something. Now, all four of these all occur within the soul. These are there inherently within the soul when we are still in the spiritual realm. So, again, so many ancient philosophies believe this, that we originate in a purely spiritual state. Then, for one reason or another, we fall into the material world. And of course, the goal is to get back to that original state of freedom, of liberation. Well, all of this occurs when we are still in that transcendental realm. Now, having these four elements, and they're all necessary. I'm aware of me. All right, I am here. I am aware of all others. I have free will. I can choose things, and I have desire. So now that I have that desire, now free will has something to operate on. All that being the case, of course, what does that mean? Oh, now we have choice. And we can choose either to pursue the trajectory of further exploration of who we are as pure soul, as pure consciousness, with God as our source. And what does that mean? We can choose an upward trajectory where now we understand, oh, there is God who is my source, and I wish to know God more and more and to serve God. Or, of course, we can choose, let's say, the downward trajectory, where rather than exploring my true self, I can create an artificial self. I can create an artificial self, sometimes called ego. In the Sanskrit, this is known as ahankara or false ego. It's interesting. Let me just deal with a little bit of the Sanskrit, because Sanskrit is one of my loves. I've studied it for a very long time. And when you look at the actual language, it's amazing. So I is aham. Aham, that is I, the word for I. Interestingly, ego, that is false ego, the idea of creating a fake self, constructing an artificial self, is known as ahamkara. Ahamkara means I maker. That's the ego. It's the I maker. Instead of looking at the true I, you're making an artificial I, an artificial sense of self. It is when a person chooses that latter that they then find themselves within the realm of materiality. And the reason why is because this is actually God's mercy. We don't see the material world as something evil, as something terrible. We agree with Platonism. I mean, for that matter, all the ancients, for the most part, agreed with this, that no, the material world is imperfect, but it's not evil. It's one of the creations of God. And we would agree that this is the case because having chosen that wrong path, that downward trajectory, all right, I don't want to explore who I really am. I want to fantasize about what I want to be. So, what does that mean? Many of us will choose, I want to be God. I want to be a creator. I want to create worlds of my own rather than serving who is actually God. So, therefore, that's how the material world is here, and we come into the material world. So, that's due to, again, ahamkara. We create an artificial sense of identity, you know. And yeah, as far as the other features, I'm sorry, very quickly to address what you were saying, there are secondary and tertiary features of the soul, and they include many things. They include wisdom. Wisdom is inherent to true wisdom is inherent to the soul. Eternality, the soul is eternal. That's another inherent attribute. Love is an inherent attribute of the soul. And of course, we can go on and on and on. There are many secondary, tertiary attributes of the soul.
Yeah, the descent of souls is a very interesting question philosophically for me within Platonism and just within like physics at a certain level. Like, how does the perfect mathematically balanced, eternal nature of law, derive some arbitrary collapse into a circumstance like the one that we're in? When I was a kid, it used to bother me that we don't live in a more like geometrically perfect, kind of symmetrical, sensible world. Things are very messy. So how do you explain the origin of disorder? It's sort of difficult because what what action of the soul necessitates that or arbitrates that? Did they have a pre-fallen state in their mind before they then acquired that appetite or made a bad, free will decision, it almost involves a kind of regress. It seems like you have to pinpoint, okay, where does the will turn awry? Like what is it ultimately that causes that descent of will? And you can chalk it up to a mistake. I think a myopia might be involved. So is it a cognitive act principally, or is it a volitional act principally that leads to this descent? Because I think there's a lot that can be kind of teased out, whichever way you fall on that. Is the cognitive element first, and that leads to a willful fall of the soul, or does the will make a mistake in its action? So I don't know if that is really covered in the traditional teachings of Sanatana Dharma. It seems like the Platonists aren't in full agreement on that particular point, and it's an area of interest for myself. So I'd be very curious to hear what you'd have to say on that.
Sure, definitely. Yeah, and there is a distinction between the two, the cognitive versus volitional. And as Sanatana Dharma teaches, first of all, as far as causality, they occur interestingly simultaneously. The reason why is because when the soul is in that transcendent state, it's in a realm without time, without space, without causality. So technically, it occurs simultaneously. But at the same time, from our perspective, we can understand that it is a matter of, to state this very simply, yes, the will gone awry. The will gone awry. So it is a willful mistake. It is a mistake that an individual is making, but at the same time, it is something that is willful, And let me tell you what is psychologically, if you could say this, as far as the psychology of the soul, pre-fall versus falling, is doing that action of the fall. What it comes down to fundamentally is the soul choosing, rather than serving and loving God, who is my source, I wish to be God. Now, to what extent, that will differ from soul to soul at that exact moment. And the reason why I say that is because even with soul in that actual instance when this occurs, as far as how consciously the soul is aware of this, that will vary from soul to soul. For some, it's a little bit more innocent. For others, it comes to the point where the soul goes from a state of purity to malice very quickly. And interestingly, when it comes to that fall, again, because you're still dealing with a state of being that transcends time itself, the decision and the fall are simultaneous. You cannot even say there is 100 billionth of a second degree of separation between I am willing to be God rather than serve God and then the fall. They're actually simultaneous. And they have to be, because the nature of the transcendent realm is one of such purity that its opposite cannot exist within that realm. So it's literally simultaneous. And you talked about physics. It's fascinating, Vedic physics, actually. It's amazing to think that the spiritual realm, whatever you wish to call it, the realm of pure consciousness, the realm of pure transcendence with no materiality whatsoever, no material stain. Again, it has no time. It transcends time, it transcends space, and it transcends causality. And what does that mean? Because interestingly, at the same time, things occur. Because this decision was made by every individual spirit, every soul within this world. Now, how can such a decision be made without those elements of time, of space, of causality? Necessarily, there has to be a time when, let's say, as an individual soul, the individual soul is in a pure state. They come to that fruition where now they can make decisions. They choose the wrong thing, and now they fall into materiality. Even stating it, there's a sequence. And yet, interestingly, within the transcendent realm, there isn't. And of course, it's a matter of perspective. As we're trying to understand it, from the material perspective, we see sequence. But if we could re-experience it when we were in the transcendent realm, it is something that occurs simultaneously. That's why this is what's fascinating. You've maybe heard this, how there are so many teachings within Sanatana Dharma where people will say such things as, for example, the material world ultimately is illusory. Our state ultimately is as if we have fallen asleep temporarily and we're dreaming, and liberation is the waking up. And you hear all sorts of interesting sayings like this to try to explain this. So yeah, it's fascinating how to explain a realm beyond physics when you're living in a realm of physics. It's difficult.
It is. Yeah. So I wonder if it's connected to the way in which in God, uh, the cognitive and volitional aspects are utterly joined. His reason is his
Mhm.
will. That's common
Yes.
to Thomism, that's classical theism in the West as
Sanatana
well as
Dharma
the
teaches the
East.
same thing. Yes.
Right. So we, from our essential nature as being inferior to God, are emulating some aspects, but not all aspects of God's cognitive aspects and his volitional aspects. We're not as providentially attendant. We aren't a lot of things that God is. So maybe it's just as a result of that necessary sequence of beings, for God to be maximally creative, he has to create utterly perfect secondary beings and then tertiary beings that sometimes make mistakes here and there, and that'll be baked into their essence. So while their essence may have its origins in eternity, the fact that they are imperfect reflections of God's perfect reason necessitates that there will be a kind of myopia or a missing of the full picture that God sees, because what's in our mind is just less by nature. And because it's less, it can't factor in everything. And so that kind of by our own essence, we take an arbitrary perspective rather than the absolutely holistic perspective from God's eye, the God's eye point of view. So, does that sound more or less on track to you?
Yeah, a little bit, except one thing I would say is that it's not that God created us imperfect. Interestingly, the Atman in and of itself, that is the soul, is actually considered to be perfect. However, with the built-in ability due to free will to choose the illusion of imperfection. So interestingly, even in our quote unquote fallen state, you pick any living being in their fallen state, their Atman itself, seated there in its innocence, is actually considered to be perfect. Now, in the same way that God is perfect, it is perfect as Atman, as soul. Yes, it cannot be equated to God. The God is infinite. The individual soul is infinitesimal. So not perfect in that sense, but perfect in and of itself. But interestingly, right now, it's going through the illusion of imperfection. And the goal, getting back interestingly to self realization, what is that self realization? It is to ultimately access that perfection of a soul, of Atman, such that all the mistakes we've made, all the illusions that we've had, all of the base desires, et cetera, melt away. And all that's left is the transcendent, pure light of our soul in its perfection. So that's the only slight distinction I would make.
Yeah, Proclus talks about a kind of cycle that souls necessarily go through. At their apex, their energies are conjoined with their essence, just like higher beings, their activities are one with their essence. They never deviate from their true self or true nature. We do deviate, but then we periodically return back. So I suppose that would, to make sense of that in terms of the kind of scheme we were just discussing, the cognitive and volitional elements by our nature, they're perfect in what they are, but they're limited. And then once we take that and become a creative source of new activity, by virtue of that limitation, we have a tendency to then fall into myopias and misrepresentations, and we are creating new realities, sort of like a child who doesn't attend carefully enough to the principles of mathematics will he's sort of being more creative than the child who does the math right. You know, like the errors, there are a million different ways to come up with error. There's only one straight and narrow way to be true to the essence of math. So we deviate into manifold errors, creating manifold experiences for ourselves. And
Fake
it's
reality.
interesting, you kind of you make a Jungian point. I know it's much older than Jung, but Jung says that the subconscious has a compensatory relationship to the conscious mind. So if our fault is being too creative and trying to be like God and control too much, our subconscious will impose constraints on us to bring us back to that equilibrium point by necessity, psychological necessity. Jung also says, though, if you read very carefully, that the external world is no different than the collective subconscious at some level. And so you can view the world as the necessary kind of compensatory function to our own hubris. It's here to humble us, to put us back in check, and ultimately to bring us back to that equilibrium point where our cognitive and volitional elements are joined in harmony with themselves, but also up to the higher harmony that they are supposed to be a part of. So I guess it's that severing the connection to that higher harmony that then leads to this kind of cycle. But the cycle is
Mhm.
inevitable, right? It can't be avoided.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. You stated that extremely well, and again, Sanatana Dharma would actually agree with what you're saying. This gets back to what I was saying before. The external world, the material world, is not an evil. In fact, on the contrary, to go even a little further, it can be our friend, actually. Even the fact that we're living in a world of self-created, self-imposed illusions. In fact, more than that, of course, there are multiple souls in this world. We are not only living our own made up reality, but our made up reality is bumping into everyone else's made up reality as well. So that makes the world even more interesting and complex. But truthfully, if we have the right approach, a good philosophical slash spiritual approach, even that which ordinarily is seen as a negative, that is the artificial construct, can serve to awaken us to what is the actual reality, to what our soul actually truly is. And again, the self of our self, God. So again, this is why the material world is not a bad place. It's been called sometimes it's a schoolhouse. It's a place where we are here to learn. It's as if, well, getting to reincarnation. It's as if, well, in our previous life, we were professors with 3 PhDs, we were very intelligent, etc. Well, we've reincarnated and now we find ourselves in school having to learn. That's what the material world is like. It's a place where, rather than seeing it as as some traditions do, like some Gnosticism, Manichaeism. It's not a horrible place. It's not an evil place. It's not, uh, spirit good, matter evil. It's not a simplistic dualism like that. But rather, on the contrary, even the material world, those around us, the people around us, the things around us, certainly nature is there to teach us and actually to help us grow. Indeed, specifically nature. One could say that within nature itself is the whispering of God trying to teach us to come back to Him. But we have to know how to hear that voice of God. And that is the entire point of practicing religion, spirituality, of doing actual practice, and engaging in philosophy. That's the whole point, is to hear that quiet voice of God in nature itself beckoning us back to Him.
That's at a relatively rarefied level of earthly existence. Most creatures don't have the luxury of philosophizing. They are just faced with the brute reality of their impotence. They're humbled. Like, imagine being an insect. There are sort of different levels, more like hellish forms of earthly existence, and then more heavenly forms of earthly existence, corresponding presumably to the state of soul of the creatures that descend to those lower levels. So some creatures have to learn lessons at the level of the absolute most base appetites, and appetite is totalizing, and you're just food for each other and there's no escaping that. And the best you can do is sort of master that level of appetite so that you understand how it operates and acquire some virtue there. And then maybe you're prepared for higher levels. But that raises the question, exactly how far can souls move up and down? If I continually make mistakes, uh, can I become a caterpillar? Or, can I ascend from my current station and become more angelic or even undescended? I believe there's probably perpetual forms of existence that aren't as entropic as this one, that souls, there is time, but there isn't the same kind of constant, we have to sweep our floors and keep things orderly. There must be, more perfect states of temporal reality that are accessible. So how far up and how far down can any given soul expect to move?
That is an extremely good question, and it will require a little bit of a somewhat lengthy answer, but I'll try to make it as brief as I can. It's a very important question because what this leads to is, of course, the question of the hierarchy of being. And in Sanatana Dharma, well, first of all, in all of the ancient, truly high civilizations, all the ancient expressions of spirituality, they all believed in hierarchy. Now I say hierarchy has become a dirty word. At some point, I want to write a book called The Dirtiest Word, A Study in the Nature of Hierarchy. People hate hierarchy now. But this was something that was natural to anyone who had intelligence. We understand that nature is hierarchy. Well, in the same way, when you're talking about the cosmos and all the various living beings who are within that cosmos, first and foremost, this is something that we need to understand, is what is the nature of consciousness itself vis-a-vis the multitude of expressions of consciousness via materiality. So this is the first thing we have to understand. Any being who is alive necessarily is consciousness. There's no such thing as organic matter. There's no such thing as you have something that is material and some magic happens, something happens, science happens to it, and suddenly it can talk to you. Suddenly it, is mobile on its own. No, if there is something that is alive, it is consciousness. It is of the nature of consciousness. And consciousness is pretty much the same, regardless of whether you see that consciousness manifest in the most brilliant human being, or in an ant, or in a caterpillar, or in a god, interestingly. So consciousness is consciousness. Now, why is consciousness manifest in all these multitudinous ways? Well, that's due to its own free will, what we, of course, call karma, this principle of karma, that we create our own existence. We create our future state by what we do ethically, by the free will decisions we make. So you see some beings who presently are in the form of a cockroach. That is a unit of consciousness that chose very wrongly. Then you see humans who are living in the lap of luxury. Well, they, did some good things, et cetera, et cetera. Now, as far as getting directly to your question, how far down, how far up? It goes as far down as far up to the point of it being experientially inconceivable, but at the same time describable. I can describe, but again, the experience is not something we can conceive. It's too low and too lofty in both of those directions. As far as how low, a person is evil enough, indeed, if they are materialistic enough, they have done enough evil deeds in their life. Oh, they could become a germ. They could become a microbe. They could become, indeed, insects. They could become a cockroach. They could become anything like this. And then everything in between, of course. You can indeed be reincarnated as an animal, as a tree, as a plant. Again, wherever you can point to something and say, that is alive. It's not organic matter. It is alive because there is a unit of consciousness imperceptibly there, present within it. It's the consciousness that gives life. Matter is not alive. Now, as far as how high up, interestingly, there is an answer for that in Sanatana Dharma. The highest being in any given universe is known as Brahma, long last day. That's very important. Whether you have long or short vowels in Sanskrit is very important. Brahma, is the highest being in any given universe. And to make it more complex, there are multiple universes, material universes within Sanatana Dharma, not just this one. Brahma is the highest being. He lives for billions upon billions of years. He is the secondary creator God, what sometimes in the West is called the demiurge. That is what Brahma is. And interestingly, Brahma, the story of Brahma is this. Again, there is one in every universe. There are multiple Brahma. When, getting back to what we were talking about before, when the soul goes from that transcendent state and through its free will chooses, no, I want to be like God, I don't want to worship God, and thus falls into the material world because that false ego has now arisen. The first being that that fallen soul becomes is Brahma, the highest being within a material world. Now, when you think about this, it makes sense that going from a purely transcendent state that is perfection, you wouldn't, with that first mistake, fall down to become a cockroach, fall down to even become a human. Necessarily, it would be that first step, a step that is so small as to be almost imperceptible. So you would go from that pure transcendent state to then the highest being within the material world. So that being the case, that is as high as we could go. We begin as a Brahma, but then from there, most Brahmas, the ego develops, and they reincarnate eventually within the material world. Every living being within the material world at one time was a Brahma, was a creator of a universe. That's how we started off. And from there, through free will, and then the necessarily attendant karma, we reincarnate. As far as what will be the next life of a Brahma, that is up to that individual. Maybe they'll fall down a little bit more and they'll be a very high god, but they won't live for billions of years. They'll live for a few million. Maybe they'll fall lower. Maybe you will go from being a Brahma to a human, etc. But that's the hierarchy. So that's why it's called samsara. It's like a circle. Through reincarnation and karma, you can become a god, you can become a human, you can become something much lower than a human. But it's all due to free will. It's not some arbitrary decision of God or gods or anyone. We create our future. That's karma.
Beautiful. And consistent with that kind of Jungian logic that the world is a compensatory mechanism to bring us back into a state of alignment with higher reality. It's interesting also, Plato in the Timaeus says that all mortal souls share in one common first birth. We're all given an equal kind of chance with our first incarnation, and then we typically descend from there. Um,
Mhm.
yeah, and a lot of this may sound still very foreign, but like I said, Plato echoes many of these ideas. Plato believed in reincarnation. I mean, even reincarnation is practically mentioned in the New Testament when I forget who is asking, some Judeans are asking Jesus, um, these people born blind, was that because of a sin of their parents or I don't they don't say past life, but they basically allude to the idea like was this a sin before this person was born, such that they deserve this? And Jesus doesn't directly answer, but in other respects, Jesus does emulate Socratic ethics and behaves very much like Socrates, and seems to effectively be a Middle Platonist. So that's my interpretation of Christianity is that Jesus was teaching the same Sanatana Dharma that we're discussing here. And early Christianity, of course, became very political, and they had to lock down certain things to be consistent with organized Judaism. But uh, but yeah, I do think there is a kind of Indian soul to Christianity, like Schopenhauer said about it. But anyway, that's kind of a digression. I do want to ask more about this question of incarnation between various levels. Um, is it possible? I mean, were we all one and the same Brahma at some level? I mean, if we continually reincarnate perpetually over enough time, do you and I, for example, ever coincide in a common past life? Like, was I you in some past life, or were you me, or it's always completely distinct?
Yeah, that's an impossibility. Each individual soul necessarily is a unique being. If they weren't a unique being, then free will would not be there. There would be so many conundrums and problems that would take place. No, every individual soul remains who they are. This is why, for example, I've talked about this before. When it comes to the idea of multiple universes, there is the true conception of multiple universes versus the science fiction Star Trek version that I mentioned once in a while. So the idea of multiple universes in the Star Trek, childish idea being that, there are an infinite number of universes. So that means there are an infinite number of Erics doing different things, or different infinite number of Acharajis doing different things. No, that would mean that the soul could be divided. That would mean that free will would mean nothing. That would mean that self inquiry, trying to discover what is the nature of oneself, would end up being meaningless, etc. No, each individual is one soul. It's not divided, and it doesn't merge into other souls. So this is why when we speak even about Brahmas, there are so many Brahmas to the point where it's almost infinite. Because again, every time a soul falls into materiality, they become a Brahma. That's why there have to be multiple universes. And they're all unique. They're unique individuals. So, yeah, you were a Brahma at one point. You created a universe. I created a universe.
So if you feel like you're not accomplished, just reflect on that past life deed. I don't mean to push back too much on this, but it's sort of it appears to me that if every creature was a Brahma, was a creator of a universe at one point, the numbers don't seem to add up correctly. People will often object to reincarnation on the basis that, the human population has increased over time. So where did those souls come from? And this is a slightly different objection along a similar line where, okay, the creator is always related to trillions upon trillions of creations, presumably in a whole cosmos that's created. So if it leads to an infinite regress, effectively, where each member of the cosmos was a creator of a cosmos. Well, then you just kind of multiply by effectively infinity, infinite times. So how does the math work on that?
The math works in the sense of infinity. So, in other words, the idea of materiality and the material, and now we have to say not just material world as in one cosmos, the material realm itself is something that does not come into actual creation and does not end. So, similar to the Aristotelian idea versus ex nihilo creation. Of course, we know that among most Abrahamists, the idea is that uh, our created universe manifests literally from nothing. That God willed something out of nothing. That's why there's a cosmos here. This is not the case for the ancients and all the ancients, the Platonists, Aristotle, Sanatana Dharma. Rather, materiality itself is considered to be an energetic realm within which, indeed, there are multiple, really an infinite number of individual material universes. And this has always been the case. The reason why it necessarily has always been the case is because it exists to that which is, of course, the transcendent realm, which necessarily always exists because it's eternal, because it's outside of time, time only applying to the material world. So, that being the case, yes, there are always uh, individual units of consciousness, what we would call souls, making wrong decisions, falling into illusion. So therefore, there are always Brahmas being born, and thus Brahmas creating universes. Now, what I think is maybe daunting about this are indeed the sheer numbers of it. The sheer numbers are truly what in Sanskrit is called achintya, inconceivable. So it gets to the point where a person would say, well, wait, these numbers are so big. How can this be? The numbers are that big. The numbers are that big. Every
Right.
individual unit of consciousness was a Brahma at one point, and that's how many universes there are.
Yeah, still the ratio is what's difficult for me. It's in a given section of the cosmos, there's a 1 to, let's say, a trillion ratio of creature to creator. And oh, here's a question that could either resolve it or clarify it otherwise. Do all things that could ever happen occur in this infinite cosmos? Because that's an argument that physicists will make, is that if the universe is spatially infinite, well, then, you know, an identical copy of the Earth statistically should be expected beyond a certain point. So if we have spatial infinity, does that exhaust all possibility of action, or is there still room for novelty through time? Like, do all things happen at once in a spatially infinite world, or does it not happen at once?
The factor that has to come into play is the idea of an infinite number of living beings, all of whom are exercising free will. Now, when you add that to the equation, the idea of there being, let's say, two universes that are in every single way truly identical, is it in theory a possibility? Sure. In theory, it is. In actuality, probably not. And again, because of the fact that, oh, if you have just two people and they each are exercising free will and they're very different people, the idea that they both utter their words at the exact same time, do everything the exact same, that's impossible practically. But then when you add in the factor of there aren't two beings with free will, but an infinite number of them, then is it in theory possible? Sure. It's kind of like the idea that, oh, if that we hear many times, you get a bunch of chimpanzees together, you put, typewriters in front of them, and in an infinite number of years, in an infinite expanse of time, could it be that they will write the entire corpus of Shakespeare? In theory, will it happen? Probably not. It's kind of the same question. So yes, in theory, could it happen? Yes, but given an infinite number of beings with free will, all of whom will express themselves differently, it probably wouldn't happen.
Interesting. Okay, so time is always novel then. Is time shared between all of these various worlds in this multiverse? Is there one universal time, or is time more or less particular to each kind of local Brahma who measures it?
Necessarily, time is particular to each specific universe. And the reason why is because there are always universes coming into being. As we just had this conversation, several universes came into being, which means that they're at their beginning stages. So time will be a little bit different. Also, within a universe itself, the Sanskrit for a universe is a Brahmanda. So it's a realm of a Brahma. Within a universe itself, interestingly, time is existent throughout, but relative to the experiencer. So this is why, for example, from a very lowly being, let's say a mosquito, 3, 4, 5 days to them is like 100 years. It's a full lifetime. For we humans, of course, 100 years is 100 years. For the gods, they can live for what, in our perspective, we would say, oh, that specific strata of gods, and there are many strata, that specific strata lives for 15 million years. For them, it's 100 years. They don't experience that, oh, yes, oh, I've lived for 1 million years and it's taken so long. No, the way that we experience 100 years, they experience the same way, but it's been 1 million. So this is why, again, there's that hierarchy, even how time is expressed, how space is expressed, how power is expressed, how everything is expressed in accordance with what strata, what level of being a specific species of being is, and then the individual within that species. So this is why, again, the highest God lives the longest. He'll live for multiple billions of years. But interestingly, even for that God, because it's the material world, eventually it comes to the point where he wakes up someday and he realizes this is my last day of life, even for him. And it's interesting. Let me tell you a very funny, interesting thing, actually, when it comes to the gods. And the gods we could talk about endlessly because they're fascinating. And again, they're just Atmans. They're just souls who they reincarnated to become gods. They will die and enter reincarnation again. But it's interesting. One way in which a god knows that they're coming to the point of death, and there are several ways that they know. One of which is dust suddenly appears. Dust suddenly appears on the things they have. There's no dust in what's called Svarga, in the heavenly realm. Again, heaven just meaning where the gods are. They're temporary, not the transcendent realm. And it's fascinating. We are blessed in Sanatana Dharma that we have, like you said before, a corpus of literature that's so vast. It talks about everything. It talks in detail about how the gods are, literally how they even know, oh, my death is coming. There are, I believe, 5 ways in which they know, and on and on. We know about the hellish realms as well. The universe, as many of the ancients would agree, it's a tripartite structure. There is, to use Tolkien's term, there's Middle Earth, there's this middle realm where we are situated. And this Earth planet is not the only planet with humans, this realm. There are multiple planets with human-like beings, some of which are much more advanced than us, actually, but they're humans. What in Sanskrit is called Manusha, human. Then there is a hellish realm, and there are 7 planetary systems that go down, and they're interesting and diverse. You don't want to go there, but they're interesting and diverse. And then, of course, the gods. There's realm upon realm upon realm, all the way up to Brahma. So it's fascinating. That's Vedic cosmology in not even the smallest nutshell, smaller than a small nutshell. But it's fascinating.
Yeah, it is. So each universe kind of measures its own time. Each soul measures its own time, and there is a relativity to time. Can you tell us more about the essence of time? What exactly does time consist in? It seems to be co-originate with space and physicality, but what is
Hmm.
time, and is it, connected essentially to soul, or what does it subsist in?
Hmm. Sure. No, that's a good question, actually. And there is an answer to that. Time itself in Sanskrit is known as kala. And kala, time, is considered to be several things. It is first and foremost one of the energies of God. Interestingly, the this is something that if you would like to do this in the future, it would be nice to do an entire discussion about divine ontology in accordance with Sanatana Dharma. That is, what is the nature of God? But this is one thing that I can mention is that there is God, but then God himself expresses himself via multiple energies. What we call energies. In some cases, these are energies that do not even have anything to do with materiality. They exist only on the spiritual realm, or even more, they are the underlying foundation for existence itself, for all reality, either material or spiritual. Then there are some of God's powers, some of his energies that apply only to materiality. Materiality in and of itself being one of them. This is known as prakriti. Prakriti is materiality in energetic form that then becomes informed as the things we see around us. But truthfully, anything that we're looking at that seems solid, ultimately it's energy, but it's a material energy. Time, in the same way, is considered to be one of these energies. Now, being an energy of God that applies only to the material realm, so you could say materiality and time are co functional, they work together. Time itself is considered to be something that is eternal. So it never ceases. And again, because it's one of the energies of the eternal, of God, necessarily it's eternal. However, it exists only such that things can occur and there can be causality within the material world. world. Without time, the entire purpose of our being here as Atmans, as soul, the entire purpose could not be fulfilled. Because what is the purpose? Of course, within the context of what we think is causality, we were in the transcendent realm. Now we're in illusion. Our goal is to go back to the transcendent realm. That's a causality, but it's a material causality. And without time, that causality would not be possible. So interestingly, time itself is something that is ever existent on the one hand. On the other hand, necessarily, it is altered in accordance with the perceptual ability and mechanisms of the individual Atman as it is in a body. This is why an Atman in a mosquito body, time goes quick, quote unquote. An Atman in the body of a god, time goes slow, quote unquote. And yes, one could say it's somewhat relative. A better way of understanding it is that it is seemingly changed in accordance with our perception, because time itself is not relevant. Our perception is. Time itself is not that's relative. But how we perceive in accordance with the perceptual mechanism that we have in whatever body we are in, that's what will seemingly alter time, etc. So yeah, time itself, that is its nature. It's one of the powers of God conjoined with the power of reality. So kala is time, prakriti, materiality itself.
So there seem to be different levels of time then. There would be subjective felt time for the individual. There would be cosmic time, which coordinates events under one Brahma. And then, since time comes from a higher source, it seems like there's a higher level of time beyond a particular cosmic creation. Um, so am I missing levels of time? And then at that highest level, for God, is there one consistent series of past, present, future? Or perhaps it's all present to God, but are all of the events arranged in one infinite series in God's mind for all time at that highest level of time? Um, or not. So yeah, are there more than those three levels? And then at the top level, does God know the ordering of all events for eternity? Or
Yeah, excellent question. Yes, there are actually multiple levels of time. There aren't just three. Again, this is why time is quote unquote altered in accordance with our perception. So you could say that there are multiple levels of time. Interestingly, when it comes to God, again, when it comes to God, we're talking about that realm which is transcendent. What is meant by transcendent? Because we've been using that word a lot. What does it actually mean? It means that which is truly beyond all materiality, that which is beyond all imperfection, beyond anything that, to state it Vedically, falls apart. So, in other words, anything that is temporary, etc., etc. Interestingly, for God, time does not exist in and of itself. All that exists for God is eternality. What uh, time itself, kala, as an energy is that eternality concretized and now made functional for the purposes of the material world. But for God, there is only eternality. Now, that being said, of course, that answers your latter question. And that is that for God, all things are present now, all places are present here. That is the nature of indeed what it means to be God. That for God, again, God exists in a realm without time. So therefore, all times, quote unquote, are present now. So yes, this is how God has omniscience. And of course, this begs the question, because if God knows that something is going to happen, is he the cause of it? Of course, no. Now, that's actually, interestingly, that's a debate that's gone back, yes, to antiquity, and it's actually answered so easily, it's mind-boggling, actually. But we can deal with that if you want later. But yes, so God is a being who transcends time. So therefore, of course, he has omniscience. He knows all things that were, that are, that shall be, and he knows them simultaneously. And he does not know them. He does not need to know them, I should say, sequentially. He simply knows them. If he needs to know the sequence, of course, that's part of omniscience. He will. If it's necessary to know a sequence, he will. But truthfully, as far as the actual knowledge content itself, regardless of past, present, future, it's all present to him at once, simultaneously. And we can go on and say the same thing about spatiality, about causality, about literally all things. And what does this lead to? And of course, we're making Mount Everest into a small hill. We're stating this very, very quickly. What does this all point to? God's unitary nature, that God is one, that God is Ekam, that God ultimately is one, because it's within God that all is resolved. All time, all knowledge, all spatiality, all cause and effect, quite literally all that is, both spiritual and material, etc. This is how God ultimately is one, but not monadic. That we can get to later, because that's the unique element of Sanatana Dharma, how God is one, but we are not God. We also are energies of God who have emanated from God within this realm of timelessness, which again leads to the mystery, but not really. It's not really mysterious, etc. But yes, we can go deeply into this.
Hmm. Right. Later Neoplatonists, and I think Plato himself, would also agree that the one is beyond the monad. Um, and the monad, of course, is super intelligible itself because intelligible content is content. And a monad is what limits and unifies. So it's kind of beyond the intelligible content. But then the one beyond that which explicitly limits is kind of utterly beyond category in the first place. You can only refer to it indirectly by analogy and things like that. So there's this kind of deep mysticism in late Neoplatonism as well.
Mhm.
Um, yeah, I'm really enjoying the discussion of time. And if we have time to dwell here, um, I want to ask more about, I guess, reincarnation in light of that conception of divine omniscience with respect to temporal things. And yes, let's hear that solution to the issue of free will. If God knows all things that will happen and knows in principle the sequence in which they will happen, then in what sense are individual beings free to choose if God knows ahead of time everything that could possibly happen? And then there's a follow-up question, but I want to hear um, that it's a common objection, so I would really love to hear that addressed.
Sure, definitely. And of course, this is something, like I said, that as you know, philosophers have been debating this, for thousands of years. I remember reading a dialogue by Augustine where it's, the two characters, I believe, are himself and he's discussing with the son, and they're talking about the nature of free will in the face of God's omniscience, and it goes on and on. And very simply, the answer is actually quite simple, and that is that merely because you know something does not mean that you're the cause of it. In other words, let me start with a nice example, and then we can discuss it further. This is one of the examples I give people. Imagine that you are standing, on a mountaintop, not necessarily the highest, but it's somewhat high. And from your vantage point, you can see another mountaintop that's close enough that you can see what's happening, but too far for you to yell out to anyone there. And as you're observing, you see someone walking toward the edge and they're completely distracted. They're on their cell phone. That's what we would say today. They're on their phone or something, and they're walking, and you can see, oh my Lord, if they continue walking, they are going to walk right off the cliff and fall and die. Yet, there's nothing you can do. You see, they walk, and then they fall, and indeed they die. Now, the fact that you knew this was going to happen doesn't mean that you caused it in any way whatsoever. We experience this being the case all the time. We observe that something is going to happen. We know it's going to happen. We can or cannot do something to stop it. And truthfully, in either case, we're not the cause. Truthfully. Morally, you could say maybe we're the cause. That's arguable. But from the perspective of the observer, you didn't make the person fall. You knew they were going to, and they did. So, in the same way, when it comes to the idea of God's knowing all things, in conjunction with an infinite number of living beings who are going to make an infinite number of free will decisions, simply because God knows something is going to happen doesn't mean He caused it. Uh, yeah, and that solves especially the moral issue of this. Yeah, simply knowing does not mean you're the cause. It means you're the knower. It means you're the observer.
Sure. Does that entail though that we could not have done otherwise than what we in fact did because God knew what we were going to do? Even if we didn't cause it, it seems like that would undercut our ability to do otherwise than we in fact do. It would almost seem like we were fated to do whatever we end up doing. Even if it's our free will decision, it's like at every point in time, it seems like we could do many things, but really we can only do the one thing that we end up doing.
Hmm. Good question. Yes, I know exactly what you mean. And this may not be a satisfactory answer, but it is the answer. And that is this. You remember several times I've talked about how living beings will experience the same phenomena from varying perspectives in accordance with many things, in accordance with their perceptual ability, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in the same way, when it comes to God's knowing things, uh, so you may have to ask the question one more time because I may be going in a different direction.
Well, if God knows everything that we will do, it seems like that means we can't do otherwise than we in fact do. Like at every moment, it seems like
Okay.
we can do multiple
Okay.
things, but really we can only do the one thing.
Yes. Okay. Very good. I was going in the right direction. So, from God's perspective, indeed, He knows what we are going to do, but at the same time, there is this dance that occurs in which God knows, but we have free will and we can change that. But God also simultaneously knows the changes in trajectory in accordance with our free will. So it is indeed a dance that occurs that is somewhat almost as what I'm doing with my hands. That there is God's knowledge on the one hand, but then the fact that could we change our mind? Yes, but God knows that too. The reason why is because of the perspectival vantage point of God. So, in other words, we often try to understand these things from the perspective of a limited being trying to understand the unlimited. Rather, we have to try to do it the other way around. On the one hand, there can be an unlimited number of individual beings, all of whom have free will, and that meaning that, yes, rather than taking this trajectory in the future, it will change on the one hand. On the other hand, there being God with his perspectival awareness, which is of the nature of the infinite, the fact that he has the ability to know every single shift of decision making and thus trajectory that it will take, there's no contradiction between the two. The reason why is if there were, it would be the contradiction between the infinite versus the finite. But now this begs the question, is there actually a contradiction between the infinite versus the finite? There actually is not. Both are necessarily present. Both both uh, both have to be there. But again, they are radically different on the one hand. On the other hand, the finite is living, is existing due to the grace of the infinite. That being the case, and again, it's difficult to explain this. We're trying to understand not how we understand God's omniscience, but how reality exists in accordance with God's omniscience, if that makes sense. So, in other words, seen from the vantage point of God, this is how it's possible for the finite beings to make a seemingly infinite number of decisions, while the true infinite has the ability to know them all and yet not take away from the freedom of the finite beings. The only way to understand this is to see from God's perspective. and that's hard.
Right. Yeah. I am asking you, Acharya, explain how God, knows eternity,
No,
and
it's a
it's a
good
big ask. I,
question.
I recognize that.
You understand what I'm saying, though.
Yes.
It's impossible for us to understand because it's like asking, how is the hippopotamus experiencing reality? You can talk about the science of it, but to fully understand it is experiential. And it's not only experiential, it's an experience that is impossible for the finite because it's saying the finite is attempting to experience from the perspective of the infinite. So, in other words, I'm saying it's impossible to
Yes.
fully understand.
Interestingly, I I think to the extent that I am following the explanation that you're giving, it concurs with one possibility explored in Catholic theology addressing this question of the seeming incompatibility of divine omniscience and human free will, and that's Molinism, which is a kind of many worlds theory of counterfactual scenarios. So, in other words, God knows all of the paths you could possibly take at every point. If you do this and then do this and then do this, he knows exactly what would happen in all of those circumstances. The implication, though, with the Molinist interpretation is that all of those possible realities have some form of reality, at least to God. And I suppose that would have to be the case because God would exhaustively know everything about even possible worlds. And so, presumably, to God, possible worlds are more real than actual worlds are to us because he knows more about them. They're more, imminent to him. They're present to him. He doesn't, I mean, potentiality is a sort of imperfect condition. And presumably for God, there is no potential versus actual. There's only the what is now and here and eternally with him, one with him. So I think something like that is a good way to approach the question. God, but then that does kind of challenge the idea that in principle this, like, God's time, the principal uh seat of time in God's omniscience, is ordinal. Time can't be an ordinal series. It would have to be some kind of branching series or a complex web, rather than, like, here's moment zero at the origin and one, two, three, and negative one, two, three. It can't just be a line. Time cannot be linear, and be consistent with that kind of Molinist or counterfactual realist interpretation of divine omniscience.
Mhm. Yeah, for God specifically, again, time is not linear. In fact, time does not touch God whatsoever. Time is something like materiality, and the pure consciousness, of which God also is pure consciousness, cannot actually touch. The same thing with time as well. As far as the idea of linear, yeah, this is something that interestingly is slightly foreign um, to Sanatana Dharma when understanding time on a cosmic scale. We in Sanatana Dharma, the idea of linear is understood, but on a smaller scale, that, oh yes, what has existed in the last 100 years. I had my father, he had his father, etc. But the idea of time on a more cosmic scale is definitely something that's cyclical. That is very cyclical within the material world. Again, none of this applies to the transcendent realm. Either way, linear or cyclical, time itself does not apply in any way. So yeah.
Except, I suppose, in God's knowledge, which, I mean, he exhaustively knows material things without being contaminated by material imperfection. So he
Mhm.
knows finite things infinitely, etc.
He
Um,
knows quite literally everything, including, as you were saying before, every probability. This is the nature of omniscience. When we say omniscience, kalagya is the idea of omniscience, knowing all things at all times. Uh, when it comes to God's omniscience, it means not just factual things that exist, have existed, will existed, but could exist. So indeed, even infinite probabilities are there as well. But again, it's just known. They're not necessarily manifest, and in any case, none of it affects God. Interestingly, God is affected by nothing outside of God, including time, including even the concept of time, including even what will happen within time. Nothing affects God. God is truly, purely transcendent, even from his own powers.
Hmm. From his own powers. That's an interesting notion. Is that similar to the essence energy distinction in God? That God's essence is totally beyond even his activities, exempt, transcendent.
Yes, yes. More, it is the idea of essence versus attribute. So I give this example many times in my lectures here. Uh, to give this example, I as a person, I have an essence. It is who I am within. It is that which is imperceptible to anyone outside of me. But then I have attributes, external attributes by which you can know me. So the fact that I have hair, I actually have pretty long hair. I keep it in a ponytail, but actually kind of comes down to here. That's an attribute of mine. It's an external attribute. It's one of the identifiers by which you know that's a Chatterjee, not this short-haired guy over here. So we all have attributes. In the same way, God has his inner essence, but then he has those things that are attributive to him as well. Interestingly, things that are attributive to him, while they can be seen as something secondary on the one hand, on the other hand, they also are non different from him. And that's also something that is considered to be ultimately inconceivable. And in fact, there is a very complex philosophical term for this in Sanskrit. It is achintya bheda abheda tattva. It is the principle of inconceivable oneness yet distinction. So this is something that we can see in God. This is something we can see in God versus the individual souls versus materiality, etc. And the way that we can understand what is the connecting point is source versus that which comes from the source, that which is independent versus that which is dependent. The way this is described in the Vedanta Sutras is Janma Yasya Yataha. This is the second verse in the Vedanta Sutras, which is the foundation of Vedanta, where it explains that this is one of the definitions of God by which you know this is God, this is not God. God is the source of all. That's the translation of that. God is the originating source and origin of all things. So this is a very nice definition. This is how, for example, some new age freak comes along. Well, I'm God. I'm supreme. Really? Oh, okay. Well, this is the definition that God is the source of all things. Can you show you're the source of all things? No, of course not. So there are several very nice definitions of God. Interestingly, and this is actually also found within Sanatana Dharma. I can't remember the Sanskrit for it, but the Anselmian proof, the ontological proof for God's existence, that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Oh, we agree with that completely. This is also a definition of God. Anything else is conceptual. God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. And yeah, I love Anselm for that reason, because he actually echoes what is there in Vedanta as well. They also have the same idea of this as a definition of God. I forget if this answers your question or not, but I hope it does.
Yeah, definitely. Essence energy versus essence attribute.
Hmm.
It raises
Yes.
further questions to my mind about whether there is prior and posterior within God. When we say God's powers, is then some aspect of God prior and another his essence, and another aspect of God, his powers, posterior? Is there superior and inferior within God, or is everything exemplary and ultimate at all levels? This is essentially the difference between classical theism in the form of Thomist divine simplicity versus the Eastern Orthodox view of God, where his essence is distinct from his energies, and they have a kind of rank. There is order within God, and he's not. simply simple. Um,
Hmm.
so they're not, I mean, there is a place for that kind of apophatic mystery or mystic theology in Eastern Orthodoxy as well. But they have room for different levels, and there is a rank order of different levels, at least between God's, core essence and his activities and the contents of his mind. The logoi, the thoughts in the mind of God are more pertinent to his energies rather than his essence itself, which is totally super intelligible beyond comprehension. And there, that concept is grouping together quite a few levels of the Neoplatonic hierarchy of beings. That's dipping all the way down into what they would call the second hypostasis. They have the first hypostasis that's ineffable, one, monad, dyad, henads, things like this up there. And then they have the second hypostasis, intelligible reality. And that Eastern Orthodox concept of God maintains the order more or less and recognizes all of those layers, or most of them, but says it's all God. In classical theism with Thomism, there's more kind of just this one totally inseparable, unitive aspect of God, and that's all we can know, and there's no rank order. So, would you say within
So,
God there is a rank of different aspects, or it's all equally ultimate?
yes. Yes. In other words, yeah, it goes back to that Sanskrit term that I had, achintya bheda abheda tattva. This is not a philosophical system in itself. Some people think it is, and it's not. It's a subcategory of Vedic philosophy, Vedantic philosophy, that deals with relation of many things, but specific relation of God versus that which can be seen from our perspective as distinct from God's essence. That achintya means inconceivable. Bheda abheda means one yet distinct tattva, principle of. So this is the idea: is that first of all, yeah, we on the one hand make things a little bit simpler, but at the same time, it's been explored very deeply. The primary distinction being God's essential nature. In fact, it's funny, just over the last few weeks, I've given lectures about this actually. God's essential nature versus God's secondary attributes. So, again, similar to what I was saying, that there is who and what God is in God's own essence versus how we relate to God. That's another way of understanding this. There is who God is, just to make this kind of funny, who God is when he's at the breakfast table just being himself versus how we relate to God as finite beings. So that's the distinction. Now, are they one? Are they simple? Or are they truly distinct? They are necessarily both. Ultimately, indeed, God is seen as one being for whom even God's energies are really a manifestation of his essence. So really they're one in that sense, but they are distinct in that they each have a distinct feature and function. Each of these energies, each of these powers, what are called shaktis in the Sanskrit. So yeah, but at the same time, again with this term I used, achintya bheda abheda tattva. Achintya means inconceivable. So ultimately, what does it mean for something to be one with God, yet you can see it functionally as distinct? It's inconceivable, but at the same time, you can point to it. And this is one of the pointers, that there is God in God's essence versus God in God's function. How God is versus how God does, if that makes sense. How God is God's essential nature. How God does is uh, are the secondary attributes of God and how we relate to God, especially initially, necessarily.
Excellent. Yeah, I think I agree with that notion that the differentiations within God, so to speak, are really relative uh properties that he has vis-a-vis creation. Even the logoi in God's mind, we're talking about the forms, and those are Eastern Orthodox people would say they're not created per se, or maybe they would say they're created energies, but in Platonism, the forms aren't um, ultimately primitive. they are emanated from the one. And so
Mhm.
the
Yeah.
one um, contains everything that it emanates unitively in itself, but relative to lower things, it has those particular relations to the forms. So for us, God has multiform energies and types of knowledge and different providential acts at different times. Within God, of course, he doesn't act at different times, but relative to us, he kind of polarizes according to our peculiar perspective, and it kind of would have to be that way. So I totally agree. Um, I just want to really, for my own purposes, and maybe some of this was a little bit deep for a casual listener who's not yet been,
This is just
inculcated
beginning
into,
stuff for your audience. This is
yeah,
just beginning stuff for your audience.
right. They're way beyond either of us, I'm sure. Audience of genius savants out there. Uh, no, I respect my YouTube audience very much. They've taught me quite a bit over the years, and I'm grateful, to have the chance to read the comments and see what people think. Because I always read comments, and when people seriously engage in arguments, yeah, I take them seriously, and I try to respond. And especially with the deeper conversations like this, probably most people won't engage, but those who do, I'm going to get some new insight even if it doesn't supersede my previous understanding, it's still going to be some you know, mental tool that I'll have. Like I can think of it this way, and I think maybe that's part of why God saw fit to create beings that were fallible. Where even if our perspective isn't as good in ultimate sense as God, we do bring manifold perspectives on this one reality and infinite new understandings of God. And so God is in a way, even though he's erroneously known by all of his creatures, he is known more. There's just uh I don't know, there's something that ultimately, even if it's inferior, um adds to a greater glory or something like that. But there's one final question I wanted to ask before we wrap up. I think we have been um
Oh, I think you muted yourself or something. I can't hear you now.
yeah, something just happened. Can you hear me now? One second.
I didn't touch anything.
Yeah, that's not your fault. Can you hear me
Oh,
now?
there you go. There you go. I can hear
Yeah,
you now.
my computer decided to change the mic. I think it was maintained for the stream. But we've been going for quite a while, and this is an intensive line of questioning, and I appreciate you being willing on the spot to go into all this. I didn't warn Acharya that we'd be,
My
talking
pleasure.
about the soul and time and in this great detail, but I definitely want to have you back on and discuss more subjects because there are very few people that I can get this deep into philosophical questions with. And but yeah, my final question relating to reincarnation. What is it that keeps track of the various incarnations that we go through? We are the measure of time insofar as that's within our power. And so the kind of differences in the experience of time um, can be explained in that way by our particular ability to track time. But we don't track all the time that we've ever existed through multiple incarnations. I mean, at one point we were a Brahma, so it's not even one particular Brahma that cracks all of our incarnations. Presumably, we become Brahma more than one time in a kind of cycle. So, what agency is it that does track that genuinely linear sequence? Because we already kind of established for God, time can't be just, one, two, three, four, five, six, a series of moments in a line like that. So, but something must be keeping track of it if that is the nature of it. So it seems to me that there's a fork, and either you would have to say that the past is not ultimately fixed because nothing is tracking it, nothing is kind of registering, a billion years ago, what was my incarnation then? Either it's indeterminate and only a certain amount of incarnations proximate to you are fully determined and tracked by your own agency, by your presiding gods in your various lifetimes recently, And then the future, of course, will be indeterminate if there are genuine branching timelines that we could go down. Um, so you either accept that or you say, no, it's fully determined in the past. Um, and something is keeping track and kind of measuring that
Mhm.
that wave function of our incarnations over billions and billions and trillions of years and ultimately through eternity. So what is it that keeps track? Or is it just indeterminate?
Very good question. I'll try to answer this well, but it's at the same time briefly. The past is determinate. The future is not. The future is indeterminate because, of course, we have free will. When it comes to the past, and this leads to, yeah, we're going to have to get together again. This leads to why Sanatana Dharma teaches that, for example, time travel is silly. Time travel is something that cannot be. First of all, there's no ancient culture that has ever spoken about time travel. This is science fiction. This is something that more recent people have spoken about. No ancient culture has talked about literally transporting yourself through time. The reason why we cannot, for example, transport ourselves back in time. Oh, I want to go back to the time of the so-called cavemen, or I would like to meet Jesus by taking a time machine going back, is because the past is determinate because it happened, yet it no longer exists other than through memory. Now, memory meaning what? Memory of the individuals who happen to remember something. But of course, that again begs the question, if we talk about something that happened a trillion years ago, who's there to remember it? It's remembered by, interestingly, the universe itself. And this gets into an entire, very interesting aspect of Sanatana Dharma, because the universe itself is considered to be a living being. You know, we believe, as all the ancients, in essentialism. I know you know this about the history of 18th and 19th century, and now 20th and 21st century philosophy, that there was a war on essentialism, the idea that things had an essence.
Let me ask
Yes,
one clarifying question before you go on. When you say
yes,
the universe, I assume you don't mean a universe created by a Brahma, but something more ubiquitous than
both.
that. Okay.
Yes, both actually, because again, this leads to something. Maybe we can talk about this in the future, because this itself is a very detailed, amazing concept that has to do with natural law. Every self-sustained unit is considered in Sanskrit to be a mandala, what's called an actual unit that has an essence. So, an individual person. Really, what is an individual person? We are a mandala. We are a composition that has an essence. You can say the same thing about a family. You can say the same thing about a nation. At one time, when nationalism existed, which it should, nationalism is a good thing. Why? This is one reason. What nationalism is, from a spiritual slash metaphysical perspective, is the idea that the nation has an essence, that there is a spirit of the nation, you know. But then we can go on. There is an essential nature to our planet. This is why every ancient culture recognized this, that our earth is not just a person with an essence, it's a mother, you know, mother nature, Gaia, Bhudevi in Sanskrit. But now you can go on bigger and bigger and bigger, to the point where each universe has an essential nature, but then materiality itself, etc. What is the essential nature of all reality, both spiritual and material? That is God. That is God. But now, getting back a little smaller to specifically what we're talking about. So within a specific cosmos, a specific universe, there is an essential nature of that universe that is even given a name, Purusha, the Purusha of that universe. That is where the total objective true memory of all things past is retained. So something may have happened. Oh, let's say with a given universe doesn't last for trillions of years. It's interesting, as far as the length of any specific universe, it very much corresponds with modern science. Carl Sagan recognized that. Modern science says, I forget the exact number, but the universe is several billion years old, this universe. Sanatana Dharma agrees. But when it comes to, oh, let's say memories of something that occurred a billion years ago, That memory is retained in concretized form. It doesn't change. You can't change the past, as we know, but it's there retained in this cosmic memory in personalized form as the spirit, the essence of our universe. That's where it's kept. Now, when it comes to the future, that's indeterminate, because now we're talking about, indeed, as we've been talking about throughout, and multitude of free wills, all acting, bouncing against each other. The number of possible outcomes, of course, given all those free wills, there's no limit. So the future is indeterminate. The past is determinate.
What's
And
the
again, I
difference
forget if that
between,
answers your question.
we're
Hmm.
getting closer for sure. What's the difference between a Purusha of a particular universe and the Brahma of that universe?
Hmm. The Brahma, yes, let me explain this. It's a technical difference. The Brahma is a being who engages in actual creation. A Purusha does not. A Purusha is that being who, several things, represents the essence of that universe, because again, like when it comes to the mandalas of every individual being, again, a person is a mandala. They're all distinct. They're all different. So each universe has an essence, a spirit, something that is in the background. That is more what the Purusha is, uh, to the point where even the Brahma rarely will interact with the Purusha, because again, it's kind of an impersonal essence, spirit nature of that given universe. A Brahma, on the other hand, his purpose is very functional. It is to create a universe. And I also have to say this very quickly about a Brahma. When I say create a universe, it's not to say that he's responsible for the creation of this cup, that he's responsible literally for the creation of all things. He sets things in motion. And then, of course, we also are co creators. We also create. So his initial activity is at the very beginning of a universe. He is still there. He is there throughout the length of a universe, throughout the life of a universe, but it's more kind of in the background. He's there as, in many cases, an arbiter. He's there to contribute to maintaining order versus chaos in the universe. So he still has function, but it's especially in the initial stages of creation. That's what each Brahma does.
Can you incarnate as a Purusha?
No, no. The Purusha, interestingly, yeah, the Purusha is not an Atman in the same way that we are. The Purusha of a universe is itself considered to be a, what in Sanskrit is technically called Angsha. It is a plenary portion of God. In other words, it's God Himself, but as a differentiated manifestation whose function is indeed to be there as the essence of that universe. So this is why, for example, in the Rig Veda, have you heard of this section? It's very famous, called the Purusha Sukta. Have you heard of this? Purusha Sukta.
The name's not familiar to me, so, but
Okay, it's in the Rig Veda, and it's one of the best known sections of the Rig Veda. It talks about this phenomenon of the Purusha. So yeah,
okay. Yeah, I'll look into it. What does that section describe exactly?
it describes, well, it is a hymn praising the this Purusha. It describes some of the features of the Purusha, what the Purusha does, and it's not very long. It's just like 2 dozen verses actually. But more than anything, it's praise of the Purusha Sukta. There are other places in the Vedic scriptures where it goes deeper into explaining the nature of the Purusha Sukta. So in several of the Puranas, it talks about this, etc. Second canto, I don't expect you to remember this, but second canto of the Srimad Bhagavatam goes deeply into this idea of the Purusha as, again, a manifestation of God, but whose sole function is to serve as, again, the spirit of our universe.
And does that Purusha experience time? It has a memory. You're saying what happened a billion years ago is remembered by that being, but does the Purusha exist in time? Does he experience time?
Good question. He does not. He understands time. He knows time. He is not existing within time, because again, it's a manifestation of God. If uh, if the Purusha experienced time, it would not be God by definition. So it wouldn't be
Right,
transcendent.
right. Okay, so uh, as far as what tracks, though, our reincarnations, we're not consigned to one universe. So we're not really governed by one Purusha across the entirety of our incarnations, because we were a Brahma of one presumably separate universe at one point in time by necessity. So that was a different Purusha that would have been tracking our, what we did at that point. So, what would track then memories of which particular past lives we had when they go beyond the domain of one particular Purusha?
Right, right. So from one universe to another. And this is indeed the case that a living being, as they're reincarnating, they can go cross universe, actually. That is indeed the case. I'll try to explain this succinctly, but in a way that it makes sense. Each individual Purusha being really a manifestation of God. The truth of the matter is, all the Purushas are the same Purusha, but it's God manifest in a manifold sort of way. Again, it gets back to this interesting concept that I keep going back to, achintya bheda abheda tattva. That on the one hand, you can see God as, oh yes, God is here, God is here, God is here, but it's all God. It's all God. So this is how there can be retained memory of our previous existences, what we did in the past, not only in one universe, but universe to universe to universe. Because while on the one hand, you can say, oh, there is the Purusha of this universe, the Purusha of this universe, the Purusha of this universe, they're all one because they're all God. So their omniscience is shared. That's something that human beings can't say. Wouldn't that be nice or a nightmare if we all shared our knowledge, simultaneously? But God can do that.
I do want to get deeper into that question because I think there's still many avenues that we didn't explore. But that you just raised another question that I kind of had in mind to ask. So since it's on the table, what about that possibility being realized through technology? You know, neural brain interfaces may allow us to upload, so to speak, not our consciousness, but a lot of the information that characterizes who we are. And if those are networked together and we have access to one another's memories, what is the implication for the state of our differentiated souls? Because it's not even just a matter of sharing memories. I mean, presumably it would be physically possible to network biologically brains together so that they are solving problems in common. I mean, experiments have been done like this on rats, actually, um, where they effectively connect the nervous system of rats and have them try to solve various problems. And in some cases, there is a cognitive improvement. In a specialized domain. So it's kind of terrifying to think about those possibilities being realized, but it seems very likely that some of that stuff will become more than science fiction in the not too distant future. So, what are some of the implications of transhumanism broadly for the uniqueness of our soul and the fate of our soul? What does that do to a soul to be linked into a kind of cybernetic hive mind?
The Borg.
Right.
To state it in Star Trek terms, the Borg. Several things to be said about this. And again, I'll try to make this brief because truthfully, in the future, we could talk about this much more in depth. Let me start from the beginning. First of all, this vision is demonic. Let me just state this in a very blunt way, in a very, almost non philosophical but factual way. Such a vision is demonic. The idea of merging, you know, eh, humans specifically with machines. Why it's demonic? For every reason imaginable, including the fact that it can potentially, if it could happen, and I don't think it ever could happen, that leads to, again, further discussion. It's actually, I don't believe, a possibility in any way. if you understand the actual nature of consciousness versus not just materiality, but man made technological constructs. The two are so disconnected to the point where it wouldn't be possible. But again, that's for the future. It's demonic because ultimately it is a way of suppressing, even taking away free will. Because there's always someone who controls the technology. You see, this is always the danger. Oh, can we have one individual who, through some transhumanist experiment, oh, they can have their quote unquote consciousness. Some people say, no, it's just their memories, it's the contents of their brain, uh, uploaded into some sort of computer. Oh, yes. Now, as you were saying, you can do this with multiple people, have them all collaborate on things, etc. For that matter, you see, this is where the hundreds of difficulties come in. Why not blend them? Why just have them cooperate? Why not blend them? Why not make them all the same? Why not make them one super consciousness instead of multiple consciousnesses? You see, when you start to get to those questions, that's where it becomes truly demonic in the true sense of that term, anti-God, anti everything that is good, that is natural, that is dharmic. And why? Because you are really exterminating the person. You're exterminating the individual. And in doing so, you're taking away their free will. You're taking away everything that, in fact, makes them consciousness. In fact, let me talk about this for a second. Uh, Consciousness and free will are considered in actual Vedanta. And sadly, I'm one of the few people alive in modernity who actually teaches this these days, because I teach Vedanta in accordance with how it was taught thousands of years ago, not modern developments, meaning the last 2,000 years. Consciousness and free will are synonymous. If you do not have free will, you cannot have consciousness, and vice versa. Again, it's like any object. How do you know this doesn't have consciousness? Because it doesn't have free will. I can do anything to it and it cannot fight back. It has no desires. It has no reaction. There is no consciousness. There is no free will that is there. You know, there's no consciousness because there's no free will. Why is there no free will in it? Because consciousness is not present. Because uh, rather than being a unit of consciousness that has self-awareness, awareness of other desires that it can act upon, and then the will to act upon those desires, it has none of the above. Therefore, it is thing versus person. Well, when you get into transhumanism via 100 different routes that ultimately lead to the same conclusion, that is taken away. Consciousness, free will, the person goes from being a person to a thing, and not just a thing, but a tool. Necessarily, a thing is a tool. It can be a weapon, it could be anything. Why is this a thing and a useful thing? Because it is a tool. I use it to bring water to my mouth, and on and on and on. So, what does this mean? That ultimately there will always be one person, or most likely a tribe of individuals, outside of that collectivity of transhumanized beings who will control it. They're not going to join it. They're too smart for that. They don't want to be one of those beings who are within that computer. They will always be outside the computer. And why? Because they're devilishly clever and smart. They know. So yeah, this transhumanism, for this reason, is quite demonic. Actually, it leads to theoretically taking consciousness and making it a rock, making it a thing.
It's interesting how many parallels I see there with diversity as well, forced diversity. Um, it is anti-God in the sense that it's the inverse motion. God moves from a one to a many in a creative way and preserves the individuality of his creatures. Whereas both transhumanism and technology uh, and diversity want to take out of a many a one. So e pluribus unum, right? Which is kind of troubling that that's a
But
motto.
in a demonic route,
Yeah, right.
a
Well,
one but demonic one. Yeah,
right. Yeah,
a
it's
new
a
world order, a globalism.
simulacrum of the one that acts as a foundation for the differentiation. Instead, you take differentiated manifold reality and destroy it to create something like a pure matter, a pure subject, rather than a pure agent, pure free being. And as well, like in terms of free will, we are not to discriminate. Well, what does discrimination mean? It means making judgments, which is fundamental to being free and making decisions. So, in order to have that indiscriminate mass, you have to kind of blend everything together through technology, through people, and yes, there will be some force that stands outside of that. And of course, in modernity, it's clear to see that there is some force socially that maintains its distinctness very strictly, right? And yet wants to deprive everything else of that individuality. So yes, demonic, anti-God, an inversion of God's process of creation in the deepest sense. And it's just very troubling that that's the direction things still seem to be headed in. I'm hopeful that we'll see some kind of golden age in the midst of the Kali Yuga, at least in the short term. But lately, I've felt that it's probably not in the cards. Or if there is a golden age, it's going to be in a very confined space. We can maybe make a golden age in our own private communities, rigorously defended. But the idea that Earth as a whole is going to experience a renaissance of spiritual wisdom, hard to imagine how that'll take place.
Sure. Yeah, and of course, we are living in a world of diversity. Not, people are not all equal. People are not all the same. All cultures are different. Genetically, people are different. So, if a golden age were to come about, which I believe it will actually, no, it will not affect the entire planet equally. Again, that sort of thinking of radical egalitarianism is itself something that's anti-golden age thinking. Again, what is part of golden age thinking? It's getting back to the ancient, getting back to natural law, the idea of hierarchy, the idea that yes, diversity is a good thing, not in the modern political sense of that term, but in the true sense of that term. That you look at the world around you and you see that in accordance with individuals' free will and karma, there's diversity. Some people are smarter than others. Some people are more good than others. Some people are taller. Some people are shorter, and on ad infinitum. And that diversity is a good thing, but we have to see it hierarchically. Of course, what modern political theoreticians want to do is they also see the diversity, but they want there to be conflict between the diversity with the idea of eradicating it ultimately, not for themselves again, but for everyone else. They want everyone to look the same, be the same, as we were saying, become one, but not them. They want to control the one. Oh, I'm sorry. I think you're muted again.
That is
There you
exactly the heart of the issue. Yeah, that time it was my fault, not the computer. Uh, it's not all in the technology, uh, ultimately. So yes, Acharya, this has been fantastic. So many interesting subjects covered. In the future, I'd like to dive deeper on all these points. You have so much breadth in what you understand about this system, what you can effectively communicate, that I don't want to spend too much time, issuing challenges, sometimes as a devil's advocate, just to hear how you would respond to the objection. Sometimes because I have some thoughts myself, like on this determinism versus indeterminism question regarding the past. I feel like there's, legitimate inquiry that I could benefit from by engaging in that. But at some point in the future. But I do want to just give respect to the breadth of your knowledge and allow you to communicate more of these ideas because sadly, it's just not present in the modern world. Very few people teach this material. And when you really look into the historical sources, this stuff is fundamental, not just for the East, but for the West itself. It really is that eternal natural law. And, we know it through Vedic texts, we know it through Platonic texts, we know it through mythic information about Norse practices, Celtic practices. We see it all over this whole great northern arc of civilization. and echoed in other places as well. So again, appreciation, namaste, appreciation to you, Acharya, for giving us your time. You deserve the respect that you have gotten and more. So any last words for our audience? Where can they find you? Anything they should check out?
Yes, yes. Actually, as far as finding me, again, dharmacentral.com, exactly how it sounds, Dharma, and then central.com. That's the best way to find information about my teachings. But I actually don't want to end by talking about me. If you don't mind, I want to embarrass you a little bit and end by speaking about you a little bit. The way that we set up this interview, of course, was that I emailed you and congratulated you on that wonderful, too brief interview that you did with Jason Kuna, and you were speaking about the community that you're starting, and you went very in depth, and I had known a little bit about how you were trying to create a truly wonderful community here in the United States and America. But listening to that, first of all, Jason himself is a wonderful person. I know him, actually. We've spoken before. Phenomenal individual, even better in real life than on air. Actually, he's actually much more calm in real life. He's very fiery when he's doing his show. But yeah, I want to say, first of all, that was an excellent interview that you did with him, and indeed, what you are trying to do in creating community is crucial. Something that's very, very important as an alternative to, yes, the craziness of the Kali Yuga that we see in the world around us now, trying to create a community that is sane, where things function the way that they should, the way that they did in the past, with actual ideals. And yes, I want to encourage people to help you with this as much as possible, to support you in every way that you need support. That means if you need donations, I hope that people in your audience are donating to you, are volunteering, are moving to your community. I'm sure you vet people very well. So if they're the right people, I hope that they move to your community and that they give you full support in every way. Because what you're doing is, again, we cannot overstate how crucial it is that we create alternative, well functioning, high trust communities in the belly of the beast.
Thank you very much. I really can't take credit for it myself. I've been involved in its creation, but it's really thanks to people like Peter Siri and Scott and the other people who were there from the beginning. The right people came together, and it doesn't feel, arbitrary. It feels necessary. It practically feels like I have no choice. Just for the well-being of my own family, I have to do this. There aren't better options, for me. Maybe I could focus on building a lot of wealth and then I could live in a safe gated community somewhere. But then how long will that realistically last? What's going to happen to that gated community in a few generations? There's no telling. And we have to take it into our own hands. But taking it back to that initial descent of the soul, we can't approach this in a purely creative way. Like I have this personal vision and I'm going to be the demiurge of my own little cosmos here. There is a necessary, Sanatana Dharma that we're trying to align with to make it real and lasting. So uh, we definitely will benefit from your teachings, and same. I think what you're doing is immensely valuable. So respect.
Well, thank you so much for having me on, and I look forward to speaking to you more in the future and going even deeper.
All right. Sounds like a plan. Excellent. Thanks everyone for listening. Remember to like the video, subscribe, and I will see you next time. Okay, I think there is quite a lag on that button.